Hello, this is the third Sunday in Lent, and this is a recording of a sermon for those people who find it a bit too difficult at the moment to get to church. The Gospel reading is a familiar one, I guess, to many. It's John chapter 4, the story of the woman at the well, and I'll read that first and then just share some thoughts with you. So we begin at verse 5 in John 4. Jesus came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not use the same utensils as Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you've said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am." As I said before reading the lesson, this is the third Sunday of Lent, and we're on a journey through various gospel lessons to Jerusalem and Easter. Last week we looked at Nicodemus in John chapter 3, and this week we look at the Samaritan woman who comes to the well, Jacob's well, in John chapter 4. There are some interesting patterns emerging in John's Gospel at this point, heralded in the prologue, where he talks about Jesus being the light that was always coming into the world. And those kind of patterns of misunderstanding and gaining understanding, darkness and light, are beginning to show themselves last week and this week in the conversations that Jesus has with Nicodemus and with the woman at the well. Nicodemus last week is male, is Jewish, is a religious authority, very much an insider who understood his inheritance to be the promises of God mediated through Moses and the law. And his problem was he couldn't quite understand that God's love wasn't limited in the way he thought it was. This week, the Samaritan woman is a very different character, but there are reasons that she needs to learn the same thing as Nicodemus, that God's love isn't limited in the way she believes. She's female, where Nicodemus was male. She's a Samaritan where Nicodemus was a Jew, and Jews and Samaritans had this distrust, this dislike, this even enmity that went back centuries. There's a line that says in one gospel lesson that Jews and Samaritans had nothing to do with each other, didn't trade with each other. Probably better rendered as didn't share common drinking vessels. So the woman comes to draw water at midday, one of the worst times of the day to do that, thinking she may not encounter anyone. So she is very much the outsider who starts by seeing everything as being different between Samaritans and Jews, and ends up with that understanding that God's love is wider than she'd thought. The incident takes place in which the commentator Gerard Sloyan calls enemy territory, at Jacob's Well. For many years, the Jews just could not consider the Samaritans even as another nation. They were alien people. One of the great things for me about John's Gospel is the way in which he manages to write, sometimes with a fantastic sense of comic timing. Let's look just at one section of this story. In verse 7, the Samaritan woman comes to draw water and Jesus asks for a drink. In verse 9, the Samaritan woman reminds him of the long-standing rift between Jews and Samaritans. Then verse 10, Jesus says if she knew who this was, then she would ask him for water, introducing this theme of living water. Hang on a minute, says the woman in verse 11, you haven't got a bucket, this is a very deep well. Do you think you're greater than Jacob? A question that's really rich with irony. Jesus says, well, that water won't satisfy you for very long. I've got a better source, a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Oh, in that case, the woman says, I'll have that water instead. It's pure sitcom writing in our generation. Two people speaking past each other with all sorts of stuff being unsaid, but being understood by the listeners, by the readers, by the audience. Sloyan says John's main concern is the heavenly authority of Jesus, the speaker, and the gift of life he holds out. Living water, at a literal level, is a running spring or stream, contrasting with the well water that now echoes a bit of what I said earlier, John's kind of contrived ambiguity, darkness and light, living water, well water. Another commentator suggests that the woman's inability to understand what Jesus meant by living water is this story's equivalent to Nicodemus failing to get hold of what being born from above meant. Both Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman get stuck in the literal, birth and a well of water, and fail to catch the spiritual truths behind what Jesus is saying. Nicodemus, for example, simply can't see beyond earthly physical birth to the spiritual birth from above. And as far as we know for certain, never moves from that place. The woman does move, but slowly. She gets eventually that it's not ordinary water Jesus is offering, but doesn't yet understand in what way it's different. Then as the story develops, we see how radically she changes her point of view. She sees him first as a man, a Jew, then a prophet, and finally even asks her community, could this be the Messiah? There's something powerful in the story about how encountering Jesus can radically change people's worldview. How do people encounter him today? What is it they're thirsty for? Is it security in their own identity? Is it companionship? Is it a place in a community? The woman at the well lived in a community near the well, but she wasn't fully a part of it. For one thing, as we said earlier, she came to collect water at midday, the daftest time possible to do that job. It meant a number of things. It meant she did it on her own, and it meant she didn't have the solidarity of other women around her. Something had separated her from everyone else, and nothing changed until she discovered she had a story to tell about acceptance, about being known by Jesus and understood. Then she was able to invite the whole community to see what she had seen. In these days of the coronavirus pandemic, this could be an important reminder to all of us, for when people's longing for community is being sorely tested by social distancing, fear about what they might catch from getting close to others. It's a literal concern at the moment, but it speaks of a deeper concern that can't always be articulated. We say we are a community of faith, and the church aims to be a place where anyone can experience hospitality, whether it's for coffee, or a lunch provided by church people, or a gathering point for them and their children, or a safe place when isolation begins to play on our mental health. For some, we can even be the place where they meet Jesus for the first time. How do we find ways of telling our own story of how Jesus revealed us to ourselves in order that he would show us himself? How do we then help others begin to make it their own experience? Surely our story is a declaration that even in illness, brokenness, uncertainty, or being pushed to the margins, Jesus continues to come to where we are, even in our isolation, and he loves and he calls each one. At the end of the passage, beyond the bit that I read, the Samaritan woman sees the community she's brought and invites them to meet Jesus. As they do that, they find faith for themselves and declare that it's not because of her, but because of what they've experienced of Jesus, that they now believe he is the Messiah. Perhaps at the moment, it's difficult for us to find easy ways of inviting people into a group. We're trying to protect each other and stay away from too many large gatherings. Perhaps at present, our way of communicating is online, through video or email. Perhaps a letter or a postcard to a locked-in friend could offer them some living water. Perhaps simply phoning up and sharing our story of being found by Jesus can break through this isolation and uncertainty. The offer of living water is still there from the one who told me everything I had ever done, and still loves me, and still calls. Amen.